The Warsaw Pact, formation of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the Cold War, 1955. The threat of West Germany's entry into NATO in 1955 caused the USSR to retaliate by forming the Warsaw Pact, or Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. Like NATO, a collective military was formed, but signed among the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe and was dominated by the USSR. If one country within the pact was attacked, the others would come to its aid. This created a counterbalance to NATO. The Warsaw Pact, as the name implies, was signed in Warsaw, Poland on May 14, 1955 by the USSR, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. The remilitarization of West Germany and its inclusion into NATO in 1955 was seen as a direct threat to the Soviet Union. The collective security of all these nations together would give the Soviet Union and its satellite states a greater defense against NATO and negotiating power over it. Apart from this motivation, the Warsaw Pact also worked as a way of strengthening the Soviet Union's control over the communist satellite states that made up the Eastern Bloc. Civil unrest in the Eastern Bloc, such as the uprising of 1953 in East Germany, was a cause of concern for the Soviet Union. The military forces of the Warsaw Pact members were placed under the command of a Soviet commander-in-chief. Soviet troops were also kept in these countries to deter any of them from leaving the Soviet sphere of control. The Warsaw Pact would cause problems for the Soviet Union just a year later in 1956, as Hungary and Poland both staged uprisings. For example, in Hungary, the new government wanted to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and see the removal of Soviet troops in its territory. Warsaw Pact troops would be used to crush uprisings within the satellite states throughout the Cold War, such as the Prague Spring in 1968. The Warsaw Pact troops, numbering over 500,000, were made up of Soviet Russians, Bulgarians, Polish, and Hungarians. Romania, Albania, and East Germany refused to participate, and soon after, Albania formally withdrew from the Warsaw Pact as a result of the invasion. The Warsaw Pact officially came to an end in 1991 following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but by the late 1980s, it was already ineffective due to sweeping political changes within the satellite states. NATO, formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Cold War, April 1949. In April 1949, NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed by several Western powers. This would be a collective military alliance which would stop Soviet aggression and prevent a repeat of nationalist militarism in Europe. By joining together, if one nation was attacked, the others would defend it militarily, under one command. Lord Hastings Lionel Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, said NATO was created to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. NATO was formed for a number of reasons in 1949. So far, the United States had initiated the Marshall Plan, which would help fund the rebuilding of Western Europe and encourage greater cooperation between Europe and the United States. The ongoing Berlin blockade from 1948 particularly stressed an urgency to do so. The Soviet Union had cut off access to Berlin, so supplies had to be airlifted in by the United States, Britain, and France. The Soviet Union had expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in their countries, forming the Eastern Bloc. China, too, was close to a communist victory. A Soviet-sponsored coup in Czechoslovakia also resulted in a full communist takeover in February 1948. The North Atlantic Treaty would be signed on April 4, 1949 in Washington, D.C. 12 countries signed it and became its members. They were the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Italy, and Portugal. Now, the United States could have a military presence in Europe which enabled a more immediate retaliation in case of a Soviet attack. This extended to a doctrine of massive retaliation, where NATO members would use nuclear weapons on the USSR as a last resort. This would also enable these countries to spend more on their economies rather than large-scale armies. The collective power of the 12 nations who promised to defend each other if one was attacked worked as a deterrent, demonstrating to the Soviet Union that Western Europe would defend itself against Soviet aggression and expansionism. Smaller countries would also now be more secure as a result of having more powerful nations defending them. More countries would join NATO later, including Greece and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1955, and Spain in 1982. In 1966, France withdrew from the military command structure of NATO, but remained a part of the NATO alliance. In 1954, the Soviet Union itself suggested that it should join NATO to preserve peace in Europe. This was rejected by NATO members because they feared that the USSR's motive was to weaken the alliance. The threat of West Germany's entry into NATO in 1955 caused the USSR to retaliate by forming the Warsaw Pact. Like NATO, a collective military was formed, but signed among the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe and was dominated by the USSR. NATO continues to this day.